look at the Render tab of the Properties panel. The Render tab provides settings to meet your rendering requirements. In other words, when you are ready to output your work of art to either a still JPEG image or an animation video, you would come here. So let's just take a brief look at what each of these settings does. Alright, let's briefly go through these settings. First up, the render settings. The render button creates your rendering as a still image. The animation button creates a rendering as an animation video. And the audio button creates an audio file based on whatever audio you have in your blend file. The next up, dimensions. Here you control the size of your actual rendering. So here we have X 1920 pixels by Y 1080 pixels. So that's 1920 length by 1080 height. And this here 50% means that it will render at half that. So that if you have 1920 by 1080, it'll render at half, so about 1000 by 500 I think. And this is generally good for preview renders. So if you have if you want to render a quick animation or a quick still image rendering and you just want to test out what it looks like, you don't have to go at full 100%. You can just go at say 10% and see what it sort of looks like, so you have an idea of what your animation will look like. And later on, once you're happy with it, you can render at full 100%. The frame range controls what frame your animation starts and what frame your animation ends. The frame step controls how many frames you want to skip. So at 1, it will just go 1 frame by 1 frame by 1 frame. If you put 2, it'll skip every other frame. 3, it'll skip every 3 frames. 4, and so on. This is great for stop motion type animation. The aspect ratio, this pretty much stretches and squashes your animation, but generally I don't really touch this. The frame rate pretty much controls how many frames will be playing back per second. So in this instance, if I have 240 frames and the frame rate is 24 frames per second, 240 divided by 24 is 10. So the entire animation here will last only 10 seconds. 24 frames per second is generally the industry standard for film. 30 frames per second or 29.97 frames per second is generally the standard for your home video camera. And I've heard of video cameras that can do 50 to 60 frames per second as well nowadays. Next up is the metadata. Metadata is generally used to help the 3D artist to see the information about their render, if that makes sense. So if I just quickly do a quick rendering, so let's just go here and press render. It's rendering at full 100%, so this is going to take a long time, so I'm just going to put 20% on that for now and hit render. Okay, so we have our rendering, and if I now enable metadata, I just have to tick this stamp output and then hit F12. I see meta information, so I can see things like the time it was rendered, the date it was rendered, the render time, the current frame it's been rendered, the scene that I'm currently working on, the camera that I'm currently working on, which is quite squashed at the moment, the file name, and things like that. Next is the output settings. So here you can choose where to save your renderings. You just select a folder and just save your rendering there. And here you can choose the extension of what you want to save your rendering as. So if you want to save it as a PNG file, you select PNG, or you can select JPEG, or Targa, or OpenEXR if you're familiar with those. I tend to stick with JPEG or PNG. If you're rendering an animation, I generally tend to stick with H.264, but you can select MPEG or AVI or whatever you like. Sampling, this is for the rendering. You can control the quality of your final render. You don't have to know about geometry. Light paths, this is generally used to control things like light bounces when you're rendering. Bit of advanced at this point, but you can speed up the render times by playing around with this. Motion blur, basically what this means is when your object moves quickly, you can see that blurry effect, and I'm sure you can see that in movies, or if you recorded yourself on a home video camera and you paused it in the middle of yourself running or something, you'll see that blurry effect. Well, Blender can now simulate that. So you just enable motion blur, you choose a shutter time, and there you go. Next up is the film settings. So there's things like exposure. If you're a camera person, you can play around with things like that. It's just photographic. It's just a photographic thing. Next, performance. This is to do with CPU performance. So depending on how many threads you have, you can either use up all your threads, or you can choose how many threads you want to use. If you use only fixed threads, such as say 4 threads, you won't stress out your computer as much as say using all threads. So in my case I have 8 threads in total. If I render now, it will use up all 8 threads. This controls the tile size, so basically 64 pixels by 64 pixels. So when I render, you can see these little boxes. These boxes are basically 64 pixels by 64 pixels. If I increase it to say 256 by 256, you can see it will render in much larger boxes. So these are 256 by 256. Next up is the post-processing. These settings will just control things like whether you want the compositor to take effect or whether you want the video editor to take effect. The bake is used to bake whatever's in your 3D scenes. If you have textures or advanced 3D stuff going on here, or you can bake them. This is generally used by some artists to simulate real-time rendering. A bit advanced, but you don't have to know about this, at least not for now. And that's pretty much all I have to say about the render tab.